In the vast, ever-moving city of New Athens, nestled among the worn streets of the Kypseli district, lived a man once full of life, whose story now rests only in the memories of those who knew him. This is the tale of Aris, a man who once brimmed with energy, laughter, and wild abandon, but ultimately found himself destroyed by his fatal passion for drugs. Aris was not always the kind of man whose life would be described as reckless, but it was the kind of life he chose. Once, long ago, he had been a close friend of mine. I don't say that he stopped being my friend, but more tragically, he simply stopped being consumed by his choices. It wasn't his heart that gave out, nor was it a slow decline. The choices he made in life always seemed to pull him faster toward an inevitable end, and one cold autumn night in New Athens, that end finally arrived. The details of his death, however, aren't the focus here. This story is about one of his last wild, reckless adventures, one that I know for certain to be true, as Aris himself told it to me. The evening had settled in with a chilly breeze blowing through the narrow streets of Kypseli. The neighborhood, always bustling and overpopulated, was quiet now, except for the occasional rumble of a passing car or the distant murmur of voices in one of the many corner taverns. An old beige sedan, a Ford Sierra that had seen better days, circled the same few blocks, looking for a place to park. Its driver, Aris, finally spotted a gap beside a scaffold set up against an apartment building's facade and brought the car to a sharp stop. With a flick of his wrist, Aris turned off the engine and sat for a moment in silence. Two other men sat with him: Marcos, a gruff man from the island of Rhodes, and Yuri, a Ukrainian who had found his way to Athens years before, each of them caught in the same downward spiral of addiction. They had all come here for one purpose: to score more cocaine. "All right, guys, hand me the money," Aris said abruptly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Marcos and Yuri exchanged a look, their bloodshot eyes wide and pupils dilated. The earlier dose they had taken was already fading, and the desperate need for more was becoming unbearable. Their faces twitched involuntarily, muscles pulling their skin tight like some unseen force was twisting them. "We need more," Yuri muttered, as if to justify the second purchase of the night. Only hours before, they had pooled their money to buy 5 grams of coke, telling themselves it would be the last time before they took a break, promises they had made to themselves countless times before. But here they were again, the evening still young, teeth grinding and hearts racing, unable to stop themselves from chasing the next hit. Aris stepped out of the car, the crisp air hitting him as he briskly walked down the street toward the square where he would meet their dealer, an Albanian they'd known for years. His thoughts buzzed with anticipation, his fingers twitching in rhythm with the beat of his heart. This wasn't the first time he'd done this, it wouldn't be the last. He found the dealer in his usual spot, blending into the shadows of the square. They exchanged a brief, casual handshake: money for drugs, the transaction as smooth as ever. But something was different this time. The Albanian handed Aris the 5 grams, but instead of the usual single package, they came in 5 separate wrappings. "What the hell is this?" Aris muttered under his breath as he shoved the packets into the hidden pocket inside his jeans. He wasn't thrilled by the change. Separate packets were risky. If they got caught, it would look like they were dealers, not just users. The thought gnawed at him as he hurried back to the car, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. He was paranoid, yes, but paranoia was a survival instinct in his world. "Let's get out of here," Aris said sharply as he slid back into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he reached for the glove box to grab their makeshift paraphernalia. "We'll do a quick line and go somewhere safer." Marcos shook his head. "I'm not snorting it," he grumbled. "I paid too much for this shit. I'm going to shoot it up." Aris glared at him. "What the hell are you talking about? We're in the middle of the street, man. We don't have time for that." But Marcos was stubborn, already pulling out a syringe and preparing to dissolve the coke in a small spoon. While Aris and Yuri quickly snorted their share, Marcos took his time, carefully bulging a vein in his arm as he clenched the needle between his teeth. Neither of them noticed the squad car that had quietly rolled up behind them. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the scene. "Hey, you guys, you're parked illegally," called the officer from inside the police car. Aris's heart skipped a beat. "Sorry, officer. We'll move right away," he said quickly, reaching for the keys. He thought for a moment that they might get away with it. The police car began to pull ahead. But then, something caught the other officer's eye. "Wait a second," the cop muttered. "Wasn't that guy holding a syringe?" Before they had time to react, the squad car screeched to a halt. Both officers jumped out, one shining a torch directly at Aris's windshield, the other drawing a gun. "Put your hands where we can see them. Get out of the car, now." The next few moments were a blur. Aris, Marcos, and Yuri were dragged from the car, handcuffed, and interrogated on the spot. The officers questioned them about the drugs, but Aris and his companions maintained a simple line of defense. They were addicts, not dealers, and hadn't scored anything yet. It was a gamble, but with the drugs hidden in his pocket, Aris hoped they could ride out the storm. Unfortunately, their luck wasn't about to turn. Within minutes, a black SUV with tinted windows arrived, flanked by another squad car. These were the DE officers, the big guns, and they weren't playing around. 2 local cops were ordered to drive Aris's Ford Sierra to the station for a thorough search, while Aris, Marcos, and Yuri were loaded into the back of the SUV, their hands cuffed together in a bizarre, tangled fashion that immobilized them completely. As they drove toward the police station, panic began to claw its way into Aris's mind. He knew they were screwed. The police would find the open packet of cocaine sitting right there on the dashboard. Even worse, they'd likely search his secret pocket and find the other 4 packets. 5 grams of cocaine divided into 5 bags, that was the kind of evidence that could land him in prison for years. The thoughts circled in his head like vultures, but as they arrived at the station and were herded into a small, dimly lit room for interrogation, a grim determination took hold of Aris. He wasn't going to let them find the drugs. He couldn't. As fate would have it, they started with Marcos. As the officers roughly searched him, Aris, standing off to the side with his hands now free, realized he had one last chance. In a split second, he made a decision that could kill him. He reached into the hidden pocket behind his knee and, with a sleight of hand movement, slipped one of the tiny packets into his mouth. He swallowed hard, feeling the bag slide down his throat. He wasn't sure if it would hold, if the plastic would break, and the lethal dose of cocaine would flood his system. But he had no other choice. Yuri, standing across from him, noticed what Aris had done and immediately started causing a distraction, loudly complaining to the officers to buy him time. Aris swallowed another packet. His heart raced as he repeated the process, 1 packet at a time, each one a gamble with his life. By the time it was his turn to be searched, all 4 packets were inside him. His mouth was dry, and the last one had stuck at the back of his throat. The cop patted him down, asking him questions that Aris could barely answer without choking. But by some miracle, he managed to force the final packet down with a cough. The officers found nothing on him, but Aris knew he wasn't safe yet. They were still waiting for the results of the car search. Any minute now, a cop would walk in holding that last packet from the dashboard, and it would all be over. But then, something unexpected happened. No illegal items found, the officer reported when they returned from searching the car. Aris stared in disbelief. He couldn't understand it. How could they have missed it? He considered the possibilities: either the officers were too incompetent to spot the drugs right in front of their eyes, or perhaps they had found it and decided to keep it for themselves. Or maybe, just maybe, there was a rare spark of compassion among them. In any case, Aris didn't waste time pondering his luck. The officers informed them they would spend the night in the holding cell, but no serious charges would be pressed. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Inside the cramped, filthy cell, surrounded by other petty criminals and addicts, Aris finally allowed himself to relax. But his relief was short-lived. A sudden, excruciating pain shot through his stomach. He doubled over, clutching his abdomen, realizing with growing terror that one of the bags had burst inside him. Yuri called for help, but by the time anyone came, Aris was already convulsing on the cold, concrete floor, foam bubbling at his mouth. I wish I could say that was the end of Aris's tale, but it wasn't. He survived that night, but barely. In the months that followed, he continued down the same dark path, each brush with death bringing him no closer to salvation. It wasn't until his final overdose, in a dingy apartment in downtown Athens, that his wild ride finally came to an end. Aris had always been larger than life, a man whose laughter echoed through crowded rooms and whose bravado knew no bounds. He wasn't the kind of person to back down from a challenge or let fear dictate his decisions. Perhaps that was his fatal flaw. In the beginning, his wild energy drew people to him like moths to a flame. He had a way of making every moment feel electric, every conversation more engaging, and every night an adventure. But like all flames that burn too brightly, Aris was destined to flicker out far too soon. We met in our early 20s, a time when the world seemed boundless and we were invincible. Aris always had big dreams of traveling the world, making money, and living life on his own terms. But somewhere along the way, those dreams began to wither, suffocated by his growing dependency on the very substances that once promised him escape. The drugs that had once heightened his experiences, making him feel larger than life, now shrank his world down to a narrow focus the next high. By the time we reached our 30s, Aris had drifted into a life where the highs no longer brought him joy, only relief from the constant, gnawing emptiness inside. He started hanging around a different crowd, people who lived on the fringes of society, barely scraping by, their lives held together by thin threads of addiction and desperation. Marcos and Yuri were among those people. They had nothing left but their vices, and in their company, Aris found himself spiraling deeper into a life from which few ever return. That night in Kypseli was a turning point, though none of us realized it at the time. As Aris, Marcos, and Yuri huddled in the Ford Sierra, their faces drawn and eyes wild, the neighborhood around them was settling into its usual nocturnal rhythms. The crumbling apartment buildings loomed overhead, their walls stained with graffiti and the passage of time. It was the kind of place where everyone knew someone who had fallen through the cracks, victims of circumstance or poor decisions. But for Aris and his companions, the streets of Kypseli felt like home, a place where they could disappear into the night, unnoticed and unjudged. As Aris made his way to the square, his mind buzzed with the familiar anticipation of the score. He had done this countless times before, navigating the underworld with a strange mix of caution and recklessness. The dealer, an Albanian named Rini, stood in the shadows like a ghost, barely visible beneath the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. The exchange was quick, almost mechanical. We all knew it was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Aris's story is one of many in a city full of lost souls. New Athens, with its ancient history and modern chaos, is a place where people come to lose themselves, to escape the lives they no longer want to live. But for some, like Aris, the city becomes a trap, a place where the promise of freedom turns into a prison of addiction and despair. In the end, Aris was a victim of his own choices, but also of a world that offered him too many temptations and not enough chances for redemption. He burned too brightly for too long, and like all flames, he eventually flickered out,